My father's will arrived in a heavy cream-colored envelope, sealed with a wax impression of the MacLeod crest, a predatory eagle clutching a lightning bolt. Even the stationery felt oppressive, a physical manifestation of the man who had always loomed larger than life. The contents, however, were a cruel joke, twisting the knife in a wound I thought had long since scarred over. Hamish MacLeod hadn't disinherited me, his only son. No, that would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he bequeathed me everything. Not just the modest trust fund I knew about, but the entire, sprawling, dilapidated estate of Obsidian Bay, perched precariously on the rugged, windswept coast of Scotland. The name itself sent a shiver down my spine, a cold draft from a past I had meticulously walled off. Obsidian Bay. A place I hadn't set foot in since I was a skinny, bewildered 8-year-old, the year my mother, Ilara, died. A place haunted not just by her spectral memory, but by a deeper, darker secret no one in our stoic, reticent family had ever dared to whisper above a hushed tone. I'm Aidan MacLeod, now 32, an architect who had spent the better part of 2 decades meticulously building a life as far away from that oppressive history as humanly possible. I'd designed sleek, modern structures in bustling cities, places where light and transparency were celebrated, not stifled. But here I was, dragged back to the desolate Scottish Highlands by the cold grip of inheritance and an even colder, creeping sense of dread. The will's stipulations were an insult wrapped in legalese. I wasn't just handed the keys. I had to reside at Obsidian Bay for a full, uninterrupted year before I could even contemplate selling it. A year. The words echoed in the solicitor's stuffy London office, each syllable feeling like a heavier link in a chain. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a life sentence, a final, sadistic twist from a man who had perfected the art of subtle torment. My initial instinct was to refuse, to walk away from the whole grim inheritance. But the solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose expression seemed permanently etched into a polite, regretful mask, had patiently explained the clauses. If I didn't comply, the entire estate, including the trust, would default to some obscure distant relative in Australia. It was a lockbox, and the year at Obsidian Bay was the key. The journey north was a descent into monochrome. The vibrant greens of the lowlands gave way to the muted purples and grays of heather-covered moors, the skies perpetually overcast, mirroring the storm brewing inside me. When the taxi finally turned down the long, winding drive, the first sight of Obsidian Bay hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't merely old, it was ancient, hunkered down against the elements like a defiant, wounded beast. The stone walls, once a proud slate gray, were now streaked with dark, damp patches, resembling old tears. The Gothic windows, tall and narrow, stared out like vacant eyes, some boarded up, adding to the general air of abandonment and decay. A chill, not entirely from the biting sea wind, permeated my bones. Stepping across the threshold felt like entering a mausoleum. The air was thick with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else, a faint, lingering aroma of disinfectant and old paper. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, a heavy blanket woven from years of unspoken words. Every floorboard creaked under my weight, every breath seemed too loud. My father, Hamish, had lived out his final years here, alone, increasingly isolated. He was known in the community as a formidable, if reclusive, figure. A self-made industrialist who'd built a minor empire in shipping and then retreated from the world after my mother's death. But this house, it felt less like a home and more like a fortress, designed not to keep the world out, but to keep its inhabitants in. Within days, the solitude began to press in. The few local staff, a taciturn groundskeeper named Angus and a formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Carmichael, whose eyes seemed to miss nothing, were efficient but distant, their loyalty to the late Hamish MacLeod palpable. I was the interloper, the prodigal son who had abandoned the family seat. In the long, echoing evenings, with the Atlantic wind howling like a mournful spirit, I started to explore. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to occupy the vast emptiness. But the house seemed to guide my hand. It began subtly. An old, leather-bound book of Scottish poetry, left open on a dusty reading stand in what used to be my mother's sitting room, now largely cleared of her personal effects. Tucked between the brittle pages was a small, crudely drawn sketch of a familiar wildflower, one she used to point out to me on our rare walks around the grounds. Then, in the enormous, rarely used library, I found a series of locked wooden cabinets, not built into the wall but standing ominously in a dark corner. They contained what looked like ledgers, meticulously labeled. And behind them, concealed by a loose panel that was clearly a later addition, was a small, brass-bound trunk. It wasn't locked, merely tucked away as if forgotten. Inside the trunk, I found a cache of old journals. Not my father's, but my mother's. Faded photographs, too, of a younger, vibrant Alara, her smile wide and unburdened, contrasting sharply with the faded, withdrawn woman of my later childhood memories. There were also cryptic letters, some addressed to my mother, some unsent drafts of her own, tucked away between the journal pages. They painted a picture of Alara, not as the frail, sickly woman my father always described, but as a fiercely intelligent, artistic spirit. A defiant spirit, who eventually, tragically, withered under my father's oppressive control. The details were sparse, fragmented, often written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. But a deeply disturbing pattern began to emerge. A pattern that hinted at less of an illness and more of a slow, deliberate suffocation. It was like finding scattered pieces of a puzzle, each one a sharp shard of memory, cutting deeper than the last. The air in Obsidian Bay suddenly felt impossibly heavy, charged with unspoken truths. The more I read, the more Obsidian Bay ceased to be just a house and transformed into a living, breathing testament to my mother's ordeal. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft sighing through the ill-fitting window frames, seemed to whisper her story. My father, Hamish MacLeod, was a successful industrialist, a man whose public persona was one of stern integrity and unwavering resolve. But in these journals, corroborated by the increasingly unsettling fragments of his own meticulous notes I was beginning to find, he was revealed as a deeply controlling, almost pathologically obsessive individual. My mother's early entries were filled with hope, her love for art, nature, and the vibrant social life she once enjoyed. But as the years turned, a chilling transformation unfolded in her words. She detailed how Hamish's concern for her delicate constitution slowly morphed into an insidious form of isolation. First, it was gentle suggestions to avoid certain social gatherings for her health. Then it became outright prohibitions. Her friends, one by one, stopped visiting, their calls unanswered or intercepted by my father or his increasingly hand-picked staff. She wrote of feeling like a bird in a gilded cage. But the cage was invisible to the outside world, crafted from my father's seemingly benign but suffocating protection. His journals, a chillingly clinical counterpoint, documented his escalating paranoia about Alara's fragility and her urgent need for protection from the perceived dangers of the outside world. He catalogued her moods, her interactions, even her dietary intake with an alarming level of detail, always couched in the language of concern for her well-being. He seemed genuinely to believe he was doing what was best, or at least, he convinced himself he was. But my mother's words painted a different picture, one of a vibrant spirit slowly being extinguished. My own childhood memories, once hazy and indistinct, began to sharpen into unsettling clarity. My mother's increasingly distant gaze, her hushed phone calls from the library when she thought my father wasn't listening, the way she would sometimes flinch, almost imperceptibly, when my father entered a room. I remembered her once trying to teach me to paint, her hands trembling as she held the brush, her eyes holding a sadness I couldn't comprehend then. My father had often dismissed her art as a frivolous distraction, another sign of her emotional instability. I remembered him telling me she was too sensitive for this world, a phrase that now echoed with sinister irony. The turning point came not with a bang, but with a quiet click. I was exploring the study, a vast room dominated by a monstrous oak desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. My father's presence still felt heavy in there, a lingering scent of pipe tobacco and old leather. I was running my hand along the cold stone of the fireplace, a habit from childhood, when my fingers brushed against a barely perceptible seam. A loose stone. Behind it, not a cavernous secret passage, but a small, perfectly square cavity. Inside, nestled snugly, was a small, ornate wooden box, polished to a dark sheen. It looked almost like a jewelry box, something precious. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lifted the lid and inside, cushioned by faded velvet, lay a single dried flower. A delicate Scottish primrose, its petals paper-thin and brittle, but instantly recognizable. It was my mother's favorite, the one she always pointed out on our rare walks around the grounds, often in hushed, almost conspiratorial tones, as if it were a shared secret between us. Pressed between the pages of a small, leather-bound book, also found in the box, was another primrose, equally withered. The book wasn't a novel or a collection of poems. It was her diary, The one I knew she'd kept, the one my father had once dismissed as silly scribbles. This wasn't just a record of her feelings. It was a devastatingly detailed chronicle of her confinement, written in her elegant, looping hand, which grew steadily more erratic and faint as the entries progressed. She detailed how my father systematically replaced her few remaining trusted staff with nurses he personally vetted cold, efficient women who seemed more like guards. Her calls to her sister in Edinburgh, once a lifeline, became monitored, then stopped altogether. She wrote of my father controlling her access to the outside world, intercepting mail, even reading over her shoulder when she tried to read a newspaper. But the most horrifying revelation was the way he began tampering with her medication. She meticulously documented how her daily doses of a mild sedative for anxiety, prescribed by their family doctor, began to change subtly. Some days, she wrote, the pills made her profoundly drowsy, her thoughts thick and hazy. Other days, they seemed to do nothing at all. She described feeling increasingly lethargic, her mind clouded, her will slowly eroding. She called it the slow fade. The terrifying truth slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. My father hadn't just isolated my mother. He had actively, methodically poisoned her. Not with a sudden, dramatic flourish, but with a cunning, drawn-out cruelty that was far more insidious. He wasn't just controlling her. He was ensuring her quiet, convenient demise, slowly extinguishing the vibrant light he couldn't control. The primrose, once a symbol of her enduring spirit, now felt like a dried tear, a silent scream entombed within the cold walls of Obsidian Bay. The air in the study, once merely heavy, now felt suffocating. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping for air in the silent, dust-laden study. My father hadn't just isolated my mother. He had actively, methodically poisoned her. The words "the slow fade" from her diary echoed in my mind, gaining a chilling, literal meaning. I saw her frail hands, the vacant look in her eyes during my last visits, the way she seemed to shrink into herself more with each passing month. All of it wasn't illness. It was a horrifying, calculated crime, meticulously orchestrated by the man who had always been my stoic, unyielding father. The fury that raged through me was unlike anything I'd ever known, a cold, righteous inferno that threatened to consume me. My father's journals, read with this new, terrifying lens, became instruments of his confession. He meticulously detailed how he had doctored medical reports, subtly altered her food and drink, and manipulated his staff. Entries about adjusting her dosage for optimal rest, or ensuring her quietude for recovery, now screamed of systematic poisoning. He'd recorded her declining physical state, her growing lethargy, her increasing confusion, not as signs of genuine illness, but as successful outcomes of his twisted regimen. He was a monster, hiding behind the veneer of a concerned husband, a grieving widower, a respectable patriarch. And I, his son, had lived in his shadow, a blind witness to the slow murder of my own mother. The local doctor at the time, Dr. Alastair Finch, was mentioned frequently in both my mother's diary and my father's notes. Always approving my father's decisions, always signing off on the fabricated health reports. My mother's entries spoke of her growing distrust of him, a fleeting hope that he might see through Hamish's charade, followed by crushing despair when he consistently validated my father's narrative. Was he complicit? Or merely misled, a pawn in my father's elaborate game? The thought that a medical professional could be so easily deceived, or worse, corrupted, added another layer of disgust to the horror. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't simply burn this house down or scream my revelations into the wind. Such an act would only be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed son, the final manifestation of a supposed family madness. This required strategy. My years as an architect, a profession that demanded meticulous attention to detail, an understanding of structure, and an eye for uncovering hidden weaknesses in a grand design, now felt like an unexpected, grim training. I had to build a case, brick by agonizing brick, just as my father had meticulously dismantled my mother's life. The next few weeks at Obsidian Bay were a blur of obsessive work. I moved from room to room, not as a resident, but as an investigator. I wore gloves, treating every document, every object, as potential evidence. I bought a high-resolution scanner, a portable printer, and reams of paper, transforming a rarely used guest bedroom into a makeshift war room. I began by cross-referencing entries. My mother's desperate pleas for fresh air, or a visit from Mary, a childhood friend, were mirrored by my father's chilling notes about controlling external stimuli or limiting unnecessary social interactions to prevent agitation. I found discrepancies in old pharmaceutical records I managed to track down online, a tedious process of cold calls to defunct pharmacies and dusty archives. My father, with his business acumen, had clearly managed to manipulate the supply chain of her medication, obtaining stronger sedatives than prescribed or perhaps even substitutes. The dosage listed on the actual prescription bottles, retrieved from an old medicine cabinet, rarely matched the amounts noted in my father's private ledgers of her daily intake. The numbers, though small, told a horrific story of escalating manipulation. Then there was the house itself. I went through the original blueprints, stored in a mildewed box in the attic. My father, in his later years, had made modifications. I found a sealed-off room, clearly designed as a more secure, isolated space, sketched onto a blueprint from years after the original construction. It was accessed only through a disguised door behind a bookshelf in my father's study, a door I had dismissed as merely a storage closet. Now, armed with my father's cryptic notes about the inner sanctum and my mother's terrified entries about the small room, I investigated. The room was bare, devoid of personal touches, with only a single, heavy armchair and a small, barred window looking out onto a desolate stretch of the sea. This was where my mother had spent her final months, her personal prison. The evidence was overwhelming, circumstantial perhaps to an outsider, but irrefutable to me. Proving it, especially decades later, felt like scaling a sheer cliff face, but the memory of my mother's faded primrose fueled every agonizing step. I wouldn't stop until the truth, however ugly, was laid bare. My focus shifted from the immediate, overwhelming grief to a cold, strategic pursuit of justice. I couldn't bring my mother back, but I could ensure that my father's carefully constructed legacy was forever tainted by the truth of his monstrous crimes. This wasn't about public shaming or simple revenge. It was about the truth. The story of Alara MacLeod, not as a victim of illness, but as a casualty of a calculated, prolonged domestic terror. I would not allow his shadow to define my future or her past. The dossier grew thicker by the day. Each piece of evidence, painstakingly cross-referenced and meticulously dated, was carefully placed into acid-free sleeves. I had my mother's diaries, her heartbreaking accounts of the slow fade. I had my father's chillingly precise notes, his clinical observations of her decline, his manipulations of her medication, his control over her environment. I had the discrepancies in her medical records, the subtle but significant changes in prescription orders, the records of specific nurses he employed, all noted for their loyalty to him rather than their medical expertise. I even had the architectural plans of Obsidian Bay, with my own annotations highlighting the sealed-off room, a physical manifestation of her psychological and physical imprisonment. The biggest obstacle wasn't the lack of evidence. It was the sheer audacity of what I was claiming. Who would believe that a respected figure like Hamish MacLeod, who had died peacefully in his sleep, eulogized by the local community as a pillar of industry, had orchestrated such a chilling, prolonged murder? The MacLeod name carried weight, prestige, and a century of unblemished reputation in the Highlands. I knew the resistance I would face, the accusations of madness, the dismissals of grief-induced delusion. But I had the proof, and I had Obsidian Bay itself. The house, once my mother's prison, became my fortress, my command center, and ultimately my greatest witness. Its very walls seemed to hum with the quiet horror of what had transpired within them. I didn't approach the local authorities immediately. I knew I needed to build an unassailable case first. Instead, I began contacting legal experts specializing in historical abuse cases, even cold case detectives who might be intrigued by the psychological complexity of such a crime. I spoke with a few, cautiously at first, testing the waters, carefully outlining a hypothetical scenario that mirrored my own. Most were skeptical, some outright dismissive. But then I found her, a retired prosecutor named Fiona Campbell, known for her tenacity and her work on obscure, challenging cases that others had deemed impossible. She listened, her gaze sharp, her questions precise, not doubting my sanity but challenging my evidence, pushing me to find more, to be even more meticulous. With Fiona's guidance, my investigation deepened. We tracked down former staff members, now elderly, some of whom remembered small, unsettling details, the constant presence of nurse aides, who seemed to control my mother's every move, the way visitors were always turned away, the strange, sickly sweet smell that sometimes permeated my mother's wing of the house. We even managed to locate the original Dr. Alastair Finch, a frail, bewildered old man living in a quiet nursing home. His memory was fragmented, but under gentle, persistent questioning, he admitted to signing forms that my father presented, trusting Hamish's judgment completely, confessing to a naive, negligent oversight that he had spent decades trying to forget. He was a man consumed by his own quiet guilt, a valuable, if unwitting, witness to my father's manipulation. The culmination of months of relentless work was a binder, thick and heavy, containing every piece of my mother's silenced story. It wasn't about public condemnation in a newspaper headline. It was about formal justice, about bringing an end to the narrative my father had so carefully constructed. The thought of bringing Hamish MacLeod's crimes into the light, even posthumously, was a terrifying one, yet also profoundly liberating. My purpose, once so unclear, was now crystal clear. Obsidian Bay, in the end, would no longer be a tomb. It would be a testament to Alara MacLeod's resilience, to her silenced voice, and to the unwavering truth that even the most meticulously buried secrets can eventually be unearthed. I was no longer the lost boy overwhelmed by a dark inheritance. I was Aidan MacLeod, an architect of justice, ready to rebuild a shattered past and construct a future free from the shadow of Obsidian Bay. I wasn't seeking revenge, not anymore. I was seeking redemption for my mother and a measure of peace for myself. My father had written his own ending, but I would write hers. And mine. The day I first walked into Fiona Campbell's modest, yet intensely focused office in Edinburgh felt like stepping from one suffocating chamber into another. But this time, the pressure was external, not internal, and it came from the world I was about to confront. Fiona, with her sharp, almost predatory intellect, had become my unlikely ally. She was a woman who didn't deal in hyperbole, only facts and the cold, hard lines of the law. A posthumous prosecution for murder, she'd stated, her voice flat, is exceedingly rare, Mr. MacLeod. The burden of proof remains, even without a body to exhume or a live defendant to cross-examine. We are effectively proving a dead man guilty. My initial shock at the bluntness of her words quickly gave way to grim determination. I understand the difficulty, Fiona, but the evidence is there. It's meticulously documented. She nodded, tapping the thick binder I'd brought her, now several inches thick, bulging with my mother's fragmented diary entries, my father's chillingly clinical notes, doctored medical records, and the blueprints of Obsidian Bay. It's compelling, certainly, for a novel. For a court of law, we need more than compelling. We need irrefutable. And we need to anticipate every single counter-argument the MacLeod family will raise to protect their name. And they did. The very moment Fiona and I made initial inquiries to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, a ripple of outrage, then a tsunami, erupted through the established circles of Glasgow and Edinburgh, where the MacLeod name held considerable sway. My distant relatives, the ones who would have inherited if I'd refused the will, were suddenly very vocal. They saw my efforts not as a quest for justice, but as an attack on the family's venerable history, a desperate attempt to discredit my father for financial gain. They hired formidable legal counsel themselves, their primary objective to bury my claims before they saw the light of day. They accused me of delusion, of succumbing to a morbid fixation with a dearly departed mother's melancholic writings. They even suggested my own mental state was fragile, implying the isolated life at Obsidian Bay had broken me. The legal process was a grinding, soul-crushing war of attrition. Every single piece of evidence had to be authenticated. My mother's diaries had to be forensically examined to prove her handwriting, to date the paper and ink. My father's journals were subjected to similar scrutiny. The old pharmaceutical records, tenuous links at best, required expert testimony to demonstrate inconsistencies in the chain of custody for my mother's medications. Dr. Alastair Finch's deposition was crucial, but his frail memory and his decades-long guilt made him a vulnerable witness. Fiona had to work tirelessly to shore up his testimony, protecting him from aggressive cross-examination that sought to paint him as either a senile old man or a deliberate co-conspirator. The media, initially fascinated by the bizarre story of the Highland heir and the haunted house, quickly became a double-edged sword. While some journalists were genuinely interested in the truth, others sensationalized the narrative, turning my mother's tragic story into tabloid fodder. I became a reluctant public figure, constantly under scrutiny. My reclusive life at Obsidian Bay, once a prison, now felt like a necessary refuge from the relentless glare. Fiona, however, was a relentless force. She understood that while a formal murder conviction of a dead man wasn't the goal, that was legally impossible in the traditional sense. The true objective was to officially acknowledge the historical wrong, to leave no doubt that my father's actions constituted murder. This would not be a criminal trial, but rather a unique civil case, aimed at officially declaring the cause of my mother's death as unlawful, based on the overwhelming evidence of my father's systematic poisoning. It was a novel legal strategy, one that required immense persistence and the conviction of a handful of key legal figures in the Crown Office. The turning point came when Fiona managed to get a sympathetic, highly respected medical examiner to review all the accumulated evidence. This examiner, Dr. Eleanor Vance, was renowned for her ethical rigor and her work on complex cold cases. After weeks of meticulous review, she provided an affidavit stating that, based on the documented manipulation of medication, the isolation, and the clear timeline of my mother's deteriorating health as recorded in her own hand, it was highly probable that Alara MacLeod's death was a direct result of deliberate, prolonged toxic manipulation by her husband. This expert opinion, combined with Dr. Finch's tearful, fragmented admissions of negligence and the physical evidence from Obsidian Bay, began to shift the scales. The MacLeod family's lawyers, sensing a real threat to the family name and their inherited wealth, tried to negotiate, offering a substantial settlement to silence me. But this wasn't about money. This was about my mother. The day the Crown Office announced their official findings was a surreal blur. They wouldn't call it a formal indictment or a conviction, given my father's deceased status, but it was a public declaration based on their investigation. Hamish MacLeod was responsible for the unlawful death of Alara MacLeod. The phrasing was precise, legally sound, and devastatingly clear. The news reverberated far beyond the quiet corners of the Highlands. It splashed across national headlines, igniting a firestorm of discussion about domestic abuse, elder abuse, and the secrets hidden behind respectable facades. The impact on the wider MacLeod family was seismic. Some reacted with outright denial, clinging to the idealized image of Hamish MacLeod. They publicly denounced me, questioning my sanity, accusing me of tarnishing the family name for some perceived grievance. Others, however, particularly the younger generation, began to ask questions, to look deeper into the stories they'd been told. Whispers of my father's controlling nature, previously dismissed as eccentricity, now gained a sinister new context. Some distant cousins even reached out to me, privately expressing their horror and offering tentative support, recognizing the courage it took to dismantle such a powerful narrative. The community in the Highlands, always reserved, was deeply divided. Some stood by the MacLeod legacy, refusing to believe such a heinous act could have been committed by one of their own. But others, particularly those who remembered Alara, her artistic spirit, her quiet sadness in later years, felt a chilling confirmation of unspoken suspicions. The local paper, usually filled with mundane news, ran a front-page story with my mother's vibrant younger photo beside a somber portrait of my father, the headline stark. Obsidian Bay secret, patriarch implicated in wife's unlawful death. For me, the immediate aftermath was a mix of exhaustion and profound relief. The legal battle was effectively over. My mother's story, once silenced, was finally told. The shadow my father cast began to recede, replaced by a painful but honest light. I had completed the year at Obsidian Bay. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where I had fought a crucial battle and, in a way, won. The next steps for Obsidian Bay were clear. I commissioned a team of structural engineers, not to renovate and whitewash its past, but to stabilize it, to ensure its history could be preserved without crumbling entirely. The sealed-off room, my mother's final prison, was transformed. I had the bars removed from the window, allowing the full, wild view of the sea to pour in. The cold, bare walls were softened with warm colors, and a single carefully chosen painting by a local artist, a vibrant landscape of the Highlands, was hung. It became a memorial space, a quiet room dedicated to her memory, a place where visitors, should they ever come, could reflect not on her suffering, but on the enduring strength of the human spirit. I established the Alara MacLeod Foundation, using a significant portion of my inheritance, the wealth my father had so carefully amassed, to fund initiatives against domestic abuse and psychological manipulation, particularly targeting hidden forms of control that often go undetected. It was a commitment to transforming pain into purpose, to ensure that what happened to my mother might help prevent it from happening to others. This act of channeling the cursed inheritance into something profoundly good became my truest act of self-assertion, my definitive break from my father's destructive legacy. I returned to architecture, not just as a designer of structures, but as a builder of narratives. My work now had a different depth, a profound understanding of how spaces can confine or liberate, how they can conceal or reveal truth. Obsidian Bay remains my primary residence, a place I've made peace with. It is no longer haunted by my father's malevolence, but resonates with the quiet strength of my mother's memory and the enduring power of truth. The journey was harrowing, but through it, I found not just justice for Alara, but a redemptive path for myself. The shadow of Obsidian Bay had indeed been long, but I had finally stepped out of it into the light.